The Lord be with you. Well, the feeding of the 5,000, this is a miracle of miracles. I mean, if we were to rank these, this has to be close to the top. It's in all four of the Gospels. It is a pretty great miracle. But what's always caught my attention in this story is that this is not just a story of abundance, or not only of abundance, because this story begins in grief. Jesus has just heard that John the Baptist has been murdered, his cousin. So he goes out to a boat alone, to a desolate place, to mourn. He sits in that boat, and he sits with the emptiness you have when you're mourning someone you love. I think we've all felt that hole where something was that is now lost. And at the same time, the crowds have heard where he is. They have followed him here. Men and women, young and old and children, all running around. They crowd the shoreline. Some are maybe curious. Some are maybe naysayers. Some may have heard the Sermon on the Mount, and others merely heard of it. All of them are hurrying along this shoreline, looking at that boat and Jesus. All are seeking healing. All are in search of this man who sits alone in that boat, grieving for his cousin John. And at this moment, when Jesus' grief could turn inward, he sees that crowd, and he's filled with compassion. And he wades out of the water and into the crowd, and he heals them, one person at a time. Heals in body, heals in soul. One after another, he heals. Now, the grief did not disappear at that moment. John is still dead. The emptiness in Jesus' heart has not been erased. Yet that emptiness is not the end of the story. In the very place where Jesus had come to look for solitude, God met him with compassion. A compassion that flowed into him and then through him to everyone on that shoreline. Evening came. The healing had gone on for hours. The place is still desolate. The crowd is hungry. And the disciples begin to count what they have. 5 loaves and 2 fish. And they come to the only conclusion that makes sense. We have nothing. And this isn't just a statement about bread. It's the language of people who've reached an end themselves. We still say those words, I have nothing. Sometimes we mean money. Sometimes we mean energy. Sometimes we mean patience. But often what we really mean is, I have nothing left in me. We're empty after the funeral, empty after another sleepless night, empty after caring for someone for so long that we no longer recognize ourselves. We know those desolate places. I have nothing left to give. But here, Jesus teaches the disciple that God's kingdom is not limited by emptiness. It begins here. The miracle begins here. I've seen that miracle. not as dramatically as 5,000 people being fed, but I have seen ordinary people who believed they had almost nothing become part of God's compassion. During COVID, I volunteered at a food pantry. I want to talk about a few of those miracles. Rodolfo had recently lost his wife, and we would push the wagon of food beside him as he navigated his way through the parking lot with his walker. And he told us that the groceries weren't for him. They were for the couple next door. And he said, they've got hard times. Maribel's husband worked at the steel mill in town, and he fell 3 floors, broke his back. He was in traction, and no one knew if he would walk again. She said to me, life goes on, and everyone needs to be fed. Then there's Amma. She was a chef from South Africa, and she would come in the last 5 minutes of the food pantry being open. This is the time when what we had left was meat that I couldn't identify, and vegetables I couldn't name, and sauces that had partial labels. And she would say, what have you got tonight? And we'd offer her everything. And she said, I will take it all. Now, she lived alone, but she went away with everything that was left, enough to feed a crowd, which is what she did. And every week, she'd come back at that 5 minutes before closing, and we'd ask her, Amma, what did you cook with all that? And she'd say, I don't remember. But it was very, very good. And in Matthew, we hear, all ate and were filled. I want to read that promise again from Isaiah, that promise that was made 700 years before this gospel. Hear, everyone who thirsts, come to the waters. And you who have no money, come, buy and eat. Come, buy wine and milk without money and without price. Rodolfo, Maribel, Amma, small offerings, infinite grace. Now let's remember where that story began. Jesus alone in a boat, sitting with his own grief, in his own emptiness. God didn't wait for that grief to be ended before he filled him with compassion, enough compassion that he walked onto that shore. God continues to pour that same compassion into us. When we are weary, when we are grieving, when we're convinced there's nothing left in us, God does not ask us first, hey, become whole. God meets us there, just as he met Jesus in that lonely boat. The compassion that Jesus met in his grief, that fed a hungry crowd, that still finds its way into ordinary hands today. God's compassion has always moved through human hands, through Christ's hands, through the disciples, through Rodolfo's, through Maribel's, through Amma's, and now, by God's grace, through ours. It turns out this story was never just about bread. It has always been about compassion. This is how healing comes. Not only through a miracle that feeds thousands, but through one neighbor who says, they got hard times. Through one woman who says, everyone needs to be fed. Through one cook who says, "Give me whatever is left," one act of compassion at a time. One blessing becomes another. One kindness becomes another. One life touches another. And this is how the kingdom of heaven comes near. It is the kingdom into which God has welcomed Isaiah today, a kingdom where God's compassion is first received and then shared, one act at a time. Amen.